Jezebel quickly became known for her notoriously cruel acts. And one of the most famous, of course, was her husband, King Ahab, coveted the nearby vineyard owned by Naboth of Jezreel. When he refused to sell it due to being inherited from his ancestors, Queen Jezebel falsely accused him of cursing God and the king, cursing God and the king, and resulting in his death via stoning. This was a terribly cruel act. She bribed two witnesses to say that he cursed against God, okay, and against the ruler. So he died. Ultimately, Elijah faced King Ahab at the same spot, declaring that all his line would be slain, and none other than dogs would consume his wicked queen. Years later, after Ahab's death in a battle against the Syrians, Jezebel was still ruling for nearly a decade. Elijah's successor, Elisha, sought to bring an end to Baal worship. Yeah, I gotta put the seats here. Okay, this is where we come into the death of Jezebel. I'm reading directly from 2 Kings 9:30-37. Then Jehu went to Jezreel. When Jezebel heard about it, she put on eye makeup, arranged her hair, and looked out of a window. As Jehu entered the gate, he asked, "Have you come in peace, you Zimri, you murderer of your master?" Now Jehu was a military man, and he wanted to become ruler over her son, and who was as bad as she was, or almost as bad, just as not notorious. Okay, but so Jehu decided we needed to get rid of him. Okay, and now remember the prophecy of Elijah. Elijah says your sons will die young. Okay, not those words, but that's your dynasty is going to end. You're not going to have a bunch of kids who are going to, like David did, who are going to carry on the legacy. Okay. So Jezreel looked up at the window where Jezebel was with all her makeup and hair and all that kind of stuff. Okay. And he called out, "Who is on my side? Who?" Well, 2 or 3 eunuchs looked down at him. "Throw her down," Jehu said. So they threw her down. And some of her blood spattered the wall and the horses as they trampled her underfoot. Jehu went in and ate and drank. "Take care of that cursed woman," he said, "and bury her, for she was a king's daughter." When they went down to bury her, they found nothing except her skull, her feet, and her hands. They went back and told Jehu, who said, "Well, this is the word of the Lord that he spoke through his servant Elijah the Tishbite. On the plot of ground at Jezreel's dogs will devour Jezebel." And that was the prophecy of Elijah. They will devour Jezebel's flesh. Jezebel's body will be dung, like dung on the ground in the plot at Jezreel, so that no one will be able to say, "This is Jezebel." So she met her a commentation on that. I got to pick up my spot here. Okay, so the dogs had eaten most of her body, according to Elijah's prophecy about poor, wicked, old Jezebel. Nothing left of her. I know that was a terrible death, and I know, obviously, she deserved it. But I don't know. In my mind, it wasn't enough. I really think she should have been put in prison for a couple of years and tortured. But as bad as her death was, it was fast. And those who have suffered in dying would rather have had a real quick, a quick out the door. But so I felt that she didn't get enough. Yes, Marlene?
Well, I was just thinking, there was, and maybe still is, a belief that you need a proper burial.
Yes.
And she was denied that.
Yes, yes. although I don't think she cared.
I don't think so either, but
But yes, you're very right, Other Kate. She had gone on throughout history. Her it's amazing because I was thinking of all the when I say the stories in the Bible, I'm not saying story like a made up thing. I'm talking about true things, but you isolate what's happened at a certain time, and it's the story true, but it goes like that. And there are very few in the Old Testament whose lives are talked about that much. I mean, she's got a big portion in the Bible, okay? And so we know her heritage and everything, where, most of the others, some of them are only mentioned very briefly. They've done an incredibly wonderful thing in the history of the Israelites, and but yet to just get a quick, thing in there. But her story, so she must have really been quite a character to have taken up that much room in the Bible. So a very bad example. But she has gone throughout history as an example for others not to follow. She embodied cruelty, greediness, and vanity like none before, since Israel had never seen a foreign princess wed to its king before. And that struck me. I never thought about that. But she was the first non-Israelite to be queen. Now, many of the previous kings had concubines, and Solomon had hundreds. Okay, David had a bunch, but they were not queens. She was the only one that was a leader. There was a note I read somewhere that said during her lifetime she was never referred to as a queen, and which was kind of interesting. They figured it kind of bothered her that they didn't call her queen. But just a little side note, okay. The particular union between Ahab and Jezebel was ill-fated. Jezebel's notorious name still resonates today. Driven by her heathen faith, we want to look back a little bit about why was she this way? Why did this woman? She wasn't a child. She was probably very young, but she wasn't a child when she became the queen. But why would she be such a rotten kid? What was she like to raise, and what did she see? What were the examples for her? Driven by her heathen faith, she led the charge against God's believers with little restraint or regard for consequences. Her devotion to idolatry, which she did get from her youth, was unyielding, as she went to great lengths to ensure it endured throughout her reign. Queen Jezebel was the kind of ruler that any true believer in God would dread. She had an army of 850 prophets who ministered under her care to Baal, and another 400 prophets of the grove, and these were the Asherah. Her rule encouraged a whole new level of debauchery. Now, we find a quote of this in Kings. It's on a different sheet. I'll quote it later. Here it is. Now, quote, "Now, therefore, send and gather together all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So this was in response to her following that Elijah came in and wanted to say, okay, if you're going to worship Baal and Asherah, let's see how all those 850 prophets, priests, whatever you want to call them, of her group do up against Yahweh. Okay, we will cover that in depth when we go to the reading that we have. So I'm not going to do that, but it is the one I mentioned earlier that it was the cutting of the bulls and the cooking of the bulls, and her her followers, or 850 men that she let out, they did everything they possibly could to light the fire, and it didn't work. And Elijah, on the other hand, did everything he could so a fire wouldn't light, and it lit. Okay, but we'll cover that later. But it proved that Yahweh was a lot more powerful than 850 of her prophets. But instead of her saying, right, you know, you guys are, your God's better than mine. It infuriated her. And that's when she went after Elijah in earnest, okay? And he had to leave and hide until earlier time. Now, why was Jezebel in the Bible so evil? Okay, the Bible says that Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were born before him. Now, I certainly wouldn't want to have that after my name, but he did. He was the worst king there was. However, his behavior stands out most because of his passive nature. Ahab's story is one of dejected sulking and scapegoating. He didn't shy away from blaming those around him for his misfortunes. But it was often Jezebel who pulled the strings behind the scenes. Despite this, he still had to face up to the consequences of his actions. And in 1 Kings 21, it says, quote, "There was none who sold himself to do what was evil in the sight of the Lord, like Ahab, whom Jezebel, his wife, incited." Okay, then we went into how she was killed. We need to consider, however, why Jezebel was so broken. Jezebel's story is shrouded in mystery, with the Bible providing few clues about her life before she became queen. However, digging deeper into what we do know suggests that certain motivations may have been behind her controversial actions. Jezebel in the Bible was a princess from an ancient Canaanite nation. Do you all remember about the Canaanites? When Joshua and Caleb came into the promised land, it was the land of the Canaanites. Why was there still a Canaanite nation in this day?
They didn't go in and kill everybody.
That's right.
They didn't obey God. That was his command.
Yeah, they
go in and wipe them all out.
Exactly, and they didn't. And this, look at, the steps that are taken. One major act that God asked them to do, they didn't do. And that there wouldn't have been a Jezebel and an Ahab if they had wiped out the Canaanites. Because the Canaanites are the ones with the god Baal, Asherah, and I can never remember, Molokai, something like that, the one that killed the children. Okay, those were all the Canaanite gods. And if they had killed them out, they wouldn't have been tempted to follow, the Canaanite religions were, the thing I think why they were so followed, they were bad and they did terrible things and people knew that, okay? But they encouraged promiscuity, sexual immorality, pleasure all the time, okay? They did never, ever encourage kindness and taking care of one another, okay? I mean, a big opposite. So eventually the Israelites, I guess they looked at their Canaanite neighbors next door and said, hey, they're having a great party, they're drinking, they're sleeping with one another and all this kind of stuff, and we got to sit here and pray, and so they didn't like that, and so they leaned toward the other side. And that is where Jezebel's influence, they went, well, first of all, I think they were very afraid of her, but secondly, the fact that they thought it was much more fun. Let's just go out and do this. Okay. Yes, Jane.
I was just going to say, they disobeyed God's ruling on what Laura had said, but also Ahab disobeyed God's ruling into not marrying outside of the Israelite tribe.
Yes.
That's another break with God that caused the problem.
It was bad enough to, associate with them, but to marry somebody, that's that's really going against things, right? But I would gather she was a very beautiful woman, and she knew about makeup and all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, he was very attracted to her, and she won. She won. Okay, it's fascinating to discover how much archaeological studies have revealed about these cultures, but they weren't exactly known for their kindness. For example, some of them even practiced child sacrifice in honor of the god Moloch. And if that wasn't bad enough, there were also beliefs around temple and shrine prostitution, which makes those passages talking about reformers driving out male prostitutes to make so much more sense. We understand now that gods could be seen as representative of individual nations, with criticism against anyone being interpreted as attacking its leaders too. So, they didn't follow priests as we have, and the Pope or your the cardinals or whatever in your religion. Instead, they followed the leader, and if the leader of the nation was an immoral person, that's who they followed. Okay, and so this made nations really bad. So a lot of why nations fought in those days was because of the gods they worshiped, and the gods they worshipped were because of how much allowance they had to go and have a fun time, rather than love. Never was love. It was all about sex. There was very little love running around in those days. Okay. Yeah, okay, we mentioned that. All right. Now, Jezebel had quite a twisted approach to leadership. She believed that demanding people follow her God and punishing those who disagreed were essential components to her ruling. Her response when Ahab sulked displays this attitude. We can almost feel the disdain in her words, as if to suggest, this is how you rule? By pouting as a child? We know this from the Bible. This was his reaction to not getting Nahab's land. Okay, unfortunately, for many under Jezebel's rule, even more extreme methods like the false accusations and murder proved necessary. It's likely that Queen Jezebel had a pretty bleak understanding of what it meant to be an empowered female ruler. She was raised in the midst of pagan cultures with terrible matriarchal figures, and ancient texts don't provide much detail about the Canaanite rulers and how they conducted themselves at this time, except when their conflicts with Israel were documented. So despite her brashness being amplified by having such a weak husband like Ahab, it would have made her behavior more noticeable and created opportunities for her to take vindictive behavior to new extremes. And don't forget, we're also talking in a time when, women were, nothing to the world, okay? But she had that incentive that she was going to be somebody. And so there probably are no matriarchal figures in the history books even that exerted feminine influence. Okay, the only influence women had in those days was their sex. If they wanted something, that's what they used. And obviously Jezebel used it to the ultimate. But what's interesting, I'm sure she did, we talk about her marriage to Ahab, and you never hear about her sleeping around, so to speak. She probably did, but I don't think sex was her driving force. Her driving force was power. That meant more to her than anything. She wanted to rule the roost, and and she may have used sex to get there. Okay, but I don't think that was that's me. But I just don't feel, because you hear about David sleeping around, and You hear about Solomon with all the women in his harem, but you don't hear about her sleeping around. She's got Ahab where she wants him, and I think she's ready to keep him there. Okay, now we're going to look. This is the part I want you to think about how it affects us. This is lessons from Jezebel in the Bible, and these relate to us. Okay, so what Jezebel did isn't. It's still going on. Okay, under a different guise, but it's still there. And so this has been broken down into things you need to think about, and you need to think about living in your life. And the first one is to admit your mistakes. That's not something we think about in terms of our religion, okay? But don't, if you screw up, say, hey, I did it, you know. I found that out when my last job I worked in. I'd go to every manager's meeting in the morning and took the notes and all that. And if something was going wrong, they would also, well, so-and-so did this. And it was because, you know, and I thought, you idiots, it only made him madder, okay? So when I messed up, I go in and I said, you know, this happened and I did it. And then he was speechless. And I know what I did. I'm not going to do it again. My son works in still over 30 years, okay? And he said, I tell guys who are afraid to go in and say they screwed up and do this and it cost money. He said, I keep telling, just go in and tell it's done and I did it and I'm sorry, I won't do it again. And again, it leaves him speechless. Okay. And then they can leave without this big, long, you know, blame everybody and everything else. So, and that's what we need to do, admit our mistakes. When Jezebel heard of Elijah's public demonstration that showed her God's no power, she refused to accept it. Instead of repenting and reflecting on the situation, which would have been a wise course of action in light of the evidence against her beliefs, she decided upon a vengeful plan without further thought. So that's where we hear that she went after Elijah. She didn't say, your God is more powerful. It was obvious his God was more powerful, but he had to leave or he would have been killed. We need to, number two, we need to serve the one true God. When the wicked Queen Jezebel married King Ahab, she quickly corrupted his religious ideals by convincing him to abandon God's teachings in favor of worshiping idols, the idols of Asherah and Baal. This sinister move caused many people to turn away from Yahweh and follow a sinful path instead. So, again, looked like she had a better thing. It not only looked like she had a better course of action, but they were afraid of her because we know, and they knew, she killed you if you didn't comply, if you didn't follow what she wanted you to follow. So she held the reins. During Ahab's reign, he turned away from God and ushered in an era where idol worship became rampant. And this is the sad thing. You know, so many of the kings, yes, they were bad people and they did bad things. But Yahweh, you know, was still present. She not only introduced new gods, she wanted the old ones out. I mean, you didn't even have a choice. Okay, this was very difficult. So I'm sure those who followed Yahweh, they had to do their worshiping in private, kind of like in World War II. You know, if you weren't a Nazi and you followed Christianity or democracy or that kind of thing, you had to be in hiding. And that's kind of what she brought out. During King Ahab's reign, King Ahab desecrated places meant for prayer to our Lord by tearing down altars devoted to him, who replaced them with structures that celebrated false gods instead. Queen Jezebel may have been a powerful ruler, but she used her influence for evil, even raiding the royal coffers to finance profits of the powerful ruler, but she used her influence for evil. Asherah and Baal, she used the money to promote Asherah and Baal during that famine that was so bad in their time, rather than letting the Jewish people return to Yahweh and ask for him to deliver. And that was the reason he sent it, because they left him and he wanted them back. But she would not allow that. She was so determined to snuff out worship of God that only a few true prophets remained, including Elijah, who had no choice but to flee. Jezebel's story serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences that come from turning away from God. After living 10 years beyond King Ahab's death, her end came swiftly after she faced off against Elijah and his prophecies. King Jehu ordered his courtiers to throw out of the upper window, where she met an awful fate. Jezebel met her demise due to punishment for daring to challenge the will of God and to cause harm to those he cared about. Her actions proved too extreme, resulting in an ending befitting her transgressions. Okay, so we need to serve the one true God, not somebody that pops up with something. Third, don't use good qualities to do evil. And this is something that sometimes is very hard to do. I think we find this a lot with politicians who reach a certain office or part in the rulings of country, not just America, but all over the world. Okay, and they become they start out with good intentions, okay, but they get in the system, the briberies, the gifts, the and power. I look at our group, and we are strong women. Everyone here is a strong woman, okay, but we don't go out and hurt people to be a strong woman. Okay, these people, power is even more influential in a person's character than sex is. Okay, unless someone uses their sex, their power over a weaker person, be it a male or a female. Okay, and that the power is what they want to rule. They want to be in charge. And I know we all have a bit of that. I want to be not a bit of. I've got a lot of I want to be in charge. Okay. I want to make. I want to say, well, I want to make this decision that's going to work. And but it's not all bad. Okay. But we do want to control what our lives are, and that's why one of the hardest things, when we realize we are Christians and we need to follow Jesus, is in the morning to say, Jesus, I turn my day over to you. And then an hour later, something happens and I want it to go my way. So when it says, don't use good qualities to do evil, I feel that. And I've got to stop and think about that. Am I going to exert myself? And is it really that important that I'm in charge of this? It's one thing when you're raising kids. Yeah. You got to be in charge or you're going to have a mess. Okay, but once they're adults, you got to let them live their lives. And so many families are broken because parents do not see that. Anybody watch the old one? Everybody Love Raymond? Did you ever watch that one? The mother-in-law, I mean, she drove them crazy because it had to be her way, and she would go. I mean, they made it funny, but we need to be careful of that. And we need to turn it over to God, because sometimes we don't see why he's pulling us in a way he's pulling us, but we just have to have the faith. And that to me is one of the hardest things, because you look at it and you say, well, this isn't really a sin, this isn't really bad, but don't push it, accept it. You'll be a lot happier, accept it. And don't fight God about your decisions. Okay. Don't use good qualities to do evil. Maybe everyone has a little bit of evil inside them, but Jezebel took it to the extreme. Despite being notorious for her wickedness and misconduct, she did have redeeming qualities. That is, if you look hard enough. Unfortunately, though, all these positive traits were overshadowed by her malicious deeds. Queen Jezebel had a powerful combination of traits. She had smarts, courage, and leadership, and these are good qualities. Okay, they are things that help us through life. However, she found nefarious uses for them. Using her intelligence to devise wicked plans, her guts to bully people around, and her charm to manipulate the king's will. All this was ultimately used to encourage pagan worship instead of obedience to God. God has bestowed us with unique gifts. So why not use them to show love and devotion towards Him? Let's make the most of our talents by using them for good rather than succumbing to dark temptations. And if you will recall, we did some study on the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And God doesn't give everybody the same gift. All right. Someone may have a scientific mind, an analytical mind. Okay. Another one may be very creative. Okay. Another one may be a good speaker. Another one good with teaching. Okay. Another one with nursing. There are so many. We can't have all of it. Okay. Much as we like to have every one of those gifts in abundance, we don't. But we need to know what our gifts are, understand what we do well, okay? You know, there's nothing worse, and I've got some backup on this, nothing worse than being in the choir, and you've got 10 great singers and one, and you just wish that one, yeah, you're laughing, you know who I'm talking about. You know, you wish that one who is singing louder than anybody else with the wrong notes, you wish you would find another gift, okay? Be it not singing. So that's kind of an extreme example, but you know, if you're not a good speaker, don't go out with the debate team, okay? Find it somewhere else. And then when you do find where your gifts are, use them. Don't be afraid to use them. They're God-given. The Spirit is the one who gives us the gifts. And if you're a good leader, a good organizer, do it. Just make sure you do it with a kindness and an inclusiveness. So, and that to me is one that we all need to be aware of. So think about your gifts. Be honest with yourself. Okay, don't wait for somebody to come to you and say, wow, you did a great job on that project. We need you for President of the United States, okay? You need to examine yourself and know what you are capable of doing well, and then do it. Get out there, and God will go with you. Okay. Avoid revenge. This is one that sometimes is difficult. I think in our life, I like to apply this. Let me read her thing, and then I'll apply it to our lives. The Jezebel spirit is one of hostility and revenge. She was so threatened by God's presence that she sought to eliminate all prophets. Her bitterness only increased when Naboth refused her husband, King Ahab, the righteous purchase of his vineyard, leading her down a darker path in an attempt at retribution. Revenge can exact a heavy spiritual toll. Rather than seek retribution, it's better to trust God and choose His peace so you can grow closer to Christ. In 1 Peter, we remember Christ, quote, when He was reviled, He did not revile in return. When He suffered, He did not threaten. He continued entrusting Himself to Him who judges justly. Unquote. When we seek revenge for wrongdoings, it's easy to forget that God is the ultimate judge. Not only will seeking retribution go against His teachings, but in doing so, we're trying to take on responsibility and power He alone holds. And, you know, justice is something as Christians we must seek. We must ask God to not judge in a way that's going to be harmful to someone. We've all been hurt. I don't think there's anyone sitting here in front of me who hasn't been hurt by someone. But sometimes you have to understand why they did what they did. There are so many incidents that people misjudge, and we need to be sometimes we are very wrong, yes. But if you turn around and be merciful and be just, you may end up with a friend instead of an enemy. I'm not saying you got to invite them for tea every afternoon, but okay, being nice to someone who's been bad to you, it can throw them, you know. It can say, you know, oh, she's so nice to me, you know. So we've all experienced both sides of the fence, all right. But if you don't seek revenge, if someone is really harming you and you are not happy being around them, then just don't be around them. I mean, that's the best. Just get out of the situation, okay? And if you have to say, I'm sorry, but we don't really work that well together, we're happier if we're not together. But you don't have to look for retribution against someone. So some of these are things that she did that we understand, and we've been in a similar situation. Okay. Do not practice idolatry. This is one that I think we totally understand as far as worshiping God is concerned. Idolatry, however, isn't an issue we should brush aside, even if it doesn't look like the traditional worship of Baal. Anything that takes our attention away from Jesus is a dangerous form of spiritual idolatry and can disrupt our relationship with him. In Colossians, St. Paul says, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, covetousness. These are adultery. In Kings and Samuel, we see how the evil Queen Jezebel sought to replace the worship of God with that of Baal. Not only was this considered sinful idolatry, but also a direct challenge against Yahweh and an act of stubborn rebellion, like practicing witchcraft. The Israelites let their pride get in the way of honoring God, resulting in a schism between them. It seems to be confirmed that stubbornness can lead us away from our faith in spiritual growth. And Samuel said to Saul, quote, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. Rejecting God's word is to reject his power and guidance in our lives. A dangerous path that can lead away light and hope. And I think we all experience that. Sometimes we do pick, you hear the expression, well, he worships money. People who go after money and do bad things because they want pay or power. Or just something that they say they think they spend more time with and more thinking about than God. Okay. I love this one. Number 7, be careful who you marry. When Ahab and Jezebel got married, her already formidable personality was given a chance to flourish. Without an assertive counterbalance from a stronger spouse, she took full advantage of that. A strong marriage isn't built on power struggles, immaturity, and hurtful dynamics. Instead, it runs on a foundation of mutual respect and love, like that which Jesus shows for his church, with the husband lovingly leading his family as Christ does us all. The wife then supports her spouse as to the Lord out of loving reverence to God's ultimate plan in their relationship together. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. That's found in Ephesians. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church. And that's St. Paul in Ephesians. Early in my life, I didn't like St. Paul. I thought he was very, very much went for the male power than the female power. But and a lot of that was taking his quotes out of context. Okay, but when you read his whole whole paragraph behind what he's saying, okay, you see that he's looking for the balance. And I think this is something, and I hope we have all found in our marriages, and that it should be an equality, and it should be a respect. Respect is so very important. Yeah, love obviously is a major thing. But one thing we tend to forget as we're married is respect. And our husbands must respect us, and we must respect our husbands. So that's something we need to be aware of. Okay, be alert and pray. Okay, the people of Israel, shaky time in their history, racing into turmoil as they contemplated whether to bow down before the false idol under King Ahab's rule or stay loyal to God. But we are told in Timothy, do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. Prayer. This is where prayer comes in, and we need to open up our increasing awareness and understanding about which direction God wants us to go in our lives. This goes back to a point we mentioned earlier, that we need to turn things over to God and ask what he wants to do. And there's an example here. Okay, listen for God's voice. I like this. Elijah wanted to make an impactful statement about God's power, so he challenged the Baal prophets to inspire repentance from idol worship and Jezebel's influence. He was sure that if people saw how mighty his God was, they would turn back towards him. The people were impressed by the show and the force exhibited by God, but of course they quickly returned to idol worship. Their return greatly saddened Elijah, who retreated to the wilderness. Now at this time, the Lord came to Elijah and told him, he said, go out and stand on the mount before the Lord. And behold, this is taken from the Bible, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake came, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After Elijah followed the Lord's physical commands, a voice gently spoke to him, leading him on his journey back to Damascus. There he was, tasked with honoring Hazael as ruler of Syria. And to Elisha, the son of Shaphat, you shall anoint to be a prophet in your place. If we want to experience God's presence, all we need is a quiet mind and an open heart. Listen attentively with stillness. It can lead us to hear the whispers of his voice. And I just love that experience, He told Elijah, call the wind down. Didn't do a thing for Elijah. They had blown up his hair because they had long hair. But okay. The earthquake, it seemed so powerful. He didn't see God in that. Okay. But it was a simple thing when he said to him that he needed to be with these people. He needed to listen. And it was quiet. And so that's something that sometimes is very hard. Okay. To find that silence, that moment, and just sit there and say, okay, God, talk to me, and accept it. Okay. We don't have to look for his voice. His voice is always there. What we have to do is listen. Okay. The blind see and the deaf hear. I mean, we need to take those things to heart. And listening, sometimes it's very hard. I don't know about you all, but I just find it tough finding a quiet spot to stay and talk. We get so busy with our days and with the things we do that we don't. You say, "Oh, I know I have to sit down and talk to you. You should sit down and talk to you guys, but I got to mop that floor now, or I got to run to the store." And unfortunately, sometimes I leave it all to the night, and I get in bed, and I say, "Now talk to me, Lord," and I fall asleep. So that's not very good. We need to give it some attention. So we've got a couple more minutes yet. Okay. Don't abuse power. This is something we got to be very careful of. Queen Jezebel was a power-hungry ruler who used her influence to get away with all kinds of sinister deeds. Take the case of Nahab in the vineyard. Jezebel coveted it, but when he refused to sell the birthright, she plotted an evil plan that would ultimately cost his life. Jezebel also ordered all of God's prophets to be executed without mercy. Leaders today need to recognize that their power, I can't emphasize this part enough. Leaders today need to recognize that their power should be used, not ill. Unfortunately, we see far too many examples of individuals in positions of authority exploiting those who look up to them, from corruption and criminal activity to stealing from the people they are meant to serve. It's an old lesson, but it's still relevant. Jezebel is a perfect illustration. Ultimately, she paid dearly for her misdeeds. So are there any comments on any of this? I'd like to know if you.
I think about an old phrase. Doesn't cover all of them, but covers a lot or a portion of some of them. Honesty is just simply the best policy.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it is. It needs to be an honesty from the heart.
Mm-hmm.
This is what we know. And honesty is very important for each of us to live and to practice or whatever. I also think honesty is very important for the person listening. If you're being honest with me, Jane, I need to hear that. I need to recognize that you are being honest with me. And I think this is the problem with a lot of political debates and everything else, where the people are so wound up in their own, they may be very honest, but there are people with an opposite point of view. And rather than arguing and this, that, and the other, try to understand their point of view. And I have been in this situation with a few people where I say, I don't agree with you at all, but I respect that that's the way you feel about a situation. And that's what leads to peace. That's what makes peace. That we are honest with. This is what I need, and I feel my people need, my family needs, or whatever. Okay, and so I think our response has to be as honest as the person who is saying it. And you look. I think of my mother, and she was in the Altar Rosary Society in the Catholic Church. And they had a meeting, and it was just before Christmas. And this was back like in the 50s, okay? And they were deciding they were going to do little gifts for each other at the Christmas party. And they argued for almost the whole night on whether it should be a limit of $5 or a limit of $10. And my mother said it was the most disgusting thing she ever said. $5 to $10 doesn't mean anything to us today. But in the 50s, that was a big difference, okay? But she was so mad. Then they finally closed that discussion. I don't remember the decision. And then someone said, well, we need to spend $500 on the priests need some new vestments for themselves. And everybody agreed. I mean, it took less than a minute. And my mother stood up and she said, yes, I agree they should have the new vestments. But she said, how can we spend 90% of our meeting over $5 and then spend $500 in less than a minute? She never went back to another meeting. It really upset her. She was very upset. Okay, I would like to close.
Barbara?
Yes?
Laura has her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're down so low. Continue.
I was just thinking of the phrase, in Jezebel's situation, pride goeth before a fall.
That's a good one. That's a good one. I like that. There's two things I want to say in closing. And
while Barbara's looking for that, I would like to just ask you next week to make sure You have your sheet, the 12 tribes of Israel, the sheet on the divided kings of the north and the south, and your sheets or maps on Elijah's ministry. To just have those handy next week, because hopefully we'll get to all three of them. You might just keep them with you now and have them every week as we go back through our King's passages.
Thank you, Marlene. Okay, first a funny before our closing prayer. Does anyone remember, some of you are way too young, back in the year was 1951, and Frankie Lane, who was a very popular singer in those days, the Mule Train, he had a hit record. It was called Jezebel. And I tried finding the lyrics, and I cannot find Wikipedia or none of them have the complete lyrics. But I do have a few of the lyrics that they showed, and I'm just going to read them to you quickly. It says, "If ever the devil was born without a pair of horns, it was you, Jezebel, it was you. If ever an angel fell, Jezebel, it was you, Jezebel, it was you. If ever the devil's plan was made to torment me, it was you, Jezebel, it was you. Grieving me, bleeding me, leaving me blue, Jezebel, it was you." There was more to that, but I wish I could have found the whole thing, but I couldn't. But that was a very popular song back in those days. How many of you might remember that? Okay. It was all right. We are going through a very difficult plan right now in our history, our country's history, the world's history. Okay, we have a lot of people suffering economically, physically. We're at war, and it's very difficult, I think, for most of us as Christians to approve the war, mainly because of what it's. I know Iran is not a good country always, but there are many, many, many innocent people there. There are children there. There are husbands and wives there. And more than ever, we need to pray for world peace. Years ago, countries fought, but they were, yes, we had World War I and World War II, where most countries were involved. But you couldn't blow them up at a whim. Now we are where we can destroy the world, okay? And if we don't destroy the world, okay, we are destroying the people within it. So this is a hymn, if you will, and I think its words are beautiful. Oh, for a world where everyone respects each other's ways. Respects each other's ways. Somebody's got an echo.
I think it's Kathy.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. Where love is lived and all is done. It's still on. Somebody got. Sorry.
Now she's
Okay. With justice and with praise. Oh, for a world where goods are shared and misery relieved. Where truth is spoken, children spared, equality achieved. We welcome one world family and struggle with each choice that opens us to unity and gives our vision voice. The poor are rich, the weak are strong, the foolish ones are wise. Tell all who mourn, outcasts belong, who perishes will rise. Oh, for a world preparing for God's gracious, glorious reign of peace, where time and tears will be no more, and all but love will cease. Have a good week.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you.